Well, boils and ghouls, it's your old pal, John Kassir, the voice of the Crypt Keeper. And I want to welcome my good fiends of the Horror Heals podcast. Is horror good for mental wellness? But of course it is. I delight in the delicious deaths of pitiful people on the silver screen. So get ready for a hell of a good time with my new fiends, Corey and Kendall, on the Horror Heals podcast.
Welcome to another episode of Horror Heals, the podcast where we celebrate the power of horror to entertain, empower, and yes, heal. Because let's be real, horror isn't just about the jump scares. Sometimes it's about making sense of our own fears, trauma, and struggles. And today's guest knows that better than most. Alex Harrod is a writer, a PhD student, and someone who understands that horror isn't just all about monsters. It's about what those monsters represent. From addiction and recovery to grief and transformation, Alex has explored the therapeutic side of storytelling, both as a reader and a writer. And let's be honest, anyone who grew up devouring point horror books with a hot chocolate is clearly our kind of people. Before we dive in, I should also mention that Kendall is dangerously close to renaming this podcast Coronation Heals because he is so obsessed with Coronation Street. Alex, welcome to Horror Heals.
Hi, lovely to see you both.
Thank you. Yes. And before we get into your story, I've got to share that Kendall is absolutely obsessed with Manchester.
I might officially be the America's biggest Corey fan that you've ever. I've watched it. I mean, I've seen it from the beginning, what you can find on YouTube, and I was watching 1988 this morning. Yeah, as I was making my breakfast. So,
have you ever visited?
I've been to the UK, but never to Manchester. And when we go, that's like the place I want to.
Right. Yes.
Anyway, I'm for listeners, there's a stereotype that I must be 85 years old if I love Coronation Street, but I don't care.
And a granny.
Yeah. So, yeah. But I love it. I think Corey knows how I feel about most American TV, especially ritual shows. I just don't think they're well done. And I love the way that it's produced. And anyway, I'll shut it down.
It's okay. You can still find the odd cobbled street when you come over, so you'll be all right.
I think he's trying to get a sponsorship going. Absolutely. All right. Alex, can you share where your interest in writing and performing came from?
Sure. So, I guess a little bit about where I'm at in life. Currently, I'm a writer, a PhD student, helpfully at the same university where I work as a senior marketing manager. So that helps with the juggling full-time work and PhD. My background is a bit mixed. So I've done some theatre and performance in the past. And I'm also a therapist, so I qualified as a counsellor last year, and I'm 5 years sober.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I think they're kind of the key things on where I'm at the moment. My PhD research is looking at both reading and writing and the therapeutic benefits and potential of them for someone in recovery like myself. I have always been a voracious reader. For horror, when I was little, I used to pile point horror books up in my bedroom and just sit on my beanbag with a hot chocolate and a pile of point horrors and go cover to cover for whole weekends. And I remember in my 20s, I wrote a blog post and R.L. Stine replied to say that he'd enjoyed the point horror blog post, and I do not think I've ever been more excited in my entire adult life. I was just like, So I've always loved books, and I've always really believed in the power of words and storytelling. As a writer, I did write when I was younger, and then lost my confidence a lot in that, a lot through my 20s and into my 30s. So it was really when I got sober, I started writing again. So that's how that's kind of all come together. It turns out that what I write now is really horrible little stories.
So how does our thesis of horror being good for mental wellness play into what you do in your life?
just listened to the episodes you did with the guys from Recreational Fear Lab, which is just such an amazing thing. And I think there's a real growing interest in the area of horror, both in terms of the community, so the community around horror and how inclusive it is and how welcoming and supportive it can be, but also the psychological benefits of horror and what people can get from it. For me, I've always loved horror. It's always been a favourite genre. I think since I was far too young to watch it. I think maybe I was 8 when I watched Poltergeist. It blows my tiny mind that is a PG certificate, because good luck. But me and my friend, I remember us like laughing and, hiding our face and kind of screaming and laughing at the same time and having just such a good time watching it, even though we were absolutely terrified, which does tie into a lot of the research around that kind of the release that can come from watching horror. I think for me, what I found is my research into bibliotherapy, which is the therapeutic benefits of reading. That was a lot around reading addiction memoirs, so reading true stories and autobiography. But what I've found is when I'm writing creatively, I write horror. And I think that's because it allows you to come face to face with monsters. It allows you to kind of revisit trauma and have a different outcome, or it allows you to kind of encounter darkness in a safe way. Because for me, I know the tropes of horror. I know how it works. I know that there's danger, but I'm watching a film or I'm reading a book. And so for me, that's where the potential for it being good for us sits, is what it allows you to do safely that can be therapeutic.
When you're writing your horror now, how much of yourself are you putting into the characters?
A lot. So I think my PhD is an autoethnographic approach. So I'm essentially taking my own experiences as the research base. I remember trying to write something that wasn't about booze, like in early sobriety. Just like, I can't really, I know that's not working. So I do tend to come back to certain themes around addiction, around trauma. What I find now is I don't tend to always put myself into the stories, but there will always be an element of my experience or something that I maybe want to unpick and haven't found a way to unpick. I do always write in the hope that it might get read. I think there's a lot of research around different types of creative writing and what can be good for our well-being. So you might journal and hope that no one ever reads it. In fact, you might want to just like set fire to it the next day and like have done with it. Or creative writing for well-being, which is more around, you are writing with a kind of an artistic product in mind. You are writing for an audience, you are writing for it to be read. But I don't think that means it can't also be therapeutic for the writer and the reader. And yeah, I don't know, maybe it's a limit to my creativity, but at the moment, I haven't branched away from kind of using my experiences a lot in my writing.
Where do you envision yourself after you complete the PhD program?
I'm coming to the end of my first year, and I keep joking that when I finish, I'm going to book a reading holiday and go and read all the books that are staring at me from the corner of the room because I'm not reading them. What I'd like to do is to run workshops, to engage with people, to do more therapeutic practice. I'm really interested in using film and books and genre therapeutically in my counselling practice. So being able to explore that a little bit. Hopefully writing more. So I've kind of had a few things published now, some shorter pieces. I'm having my novels out there. I'm trying to move that forward. So doing more writing, hopefully, and still sober. That's kind of main goals.
Yeah.
We were on your website a little while ago, and Kendall was reading some things today, and I'm thinking to myself, when does Alex sleep?
Bizarrely, this is me on a kind of, I've got a lot better at saying no to.
I remember being a grad student in a master's program and was working full time, was working at the university for like 20 hours a week to help fund my studies. And I just don't remember sleeping during those years. So I have a lot of respect for what you're doing.
Right. We often relate that period of Kendall's life because we didn't know each other then. to music that he doesn't know, because we have music playing constantly in the house. But the years that he was in college, there's some blanks there.
Yeah. I'll say to Corey, I'll be like, what year did this come out? And he's like 93. No way I would know it.
That's amazing. Just a complete blank spot.
Yep.
Yeah.
The
I think I'll find that.
Things that I like and discovering, sadly, 30
But
years
you get
later.
to discover them now, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, even like his favorite groups, Pet Shop Boys and Duran Duran. Like there's just a couple of albums that he's just like, he had to find them later because
I know. We joke about it. The people that I knew during that period, it's like we were all equally busy and not traditional students in that respect. Wow. I don't think I could do it. But I mean, at this age, I don't think I could do it.
I think part of it is I take the pressure off my writing a lot. I used to be I think being busy used to be a coping mechanism for me. So having 5 billion projects on, in a similar way to drinking, it's addictive. Kind of workaholism is addictive. Needing to, judging your worth on your productivity. I think being busy was definitely an avoidance thing for me. So now, if I don't write some days, I'm fine with that. If I get the urge to write, I'll try and carve the time to do it. I spend a lot of time with my animals, just kind of chilling out. I watch a lot of films, so that's kind of my downtime. And I think trying to shuffle things so that, yes, I am still busy, but I get a lot of joy from what I do. And I think that's been a big change.
I think, when you can focus on things that do bring you joy, that's what matters, right?
Yeah, we definitely carve out some time to watch horror whenever we can.
Yes.
You mentioned Poltergeist, and I have to agree with you. How that movie was a PG, well, it was prior to the PG-13 rating, which that was probably one of the movies where they said, woo, that's not in between. What genres are you drawn to within horror?
I was 13 when The Craft and Scream came out. I was 16 when Blair Witch came out. It was like a really beautiful time, I think, for kind of teen horror and also just kind of cool horror. Like, it was very good. And obviously went through a big, like, sexy vampires phase. So Lost Boys, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and Interview with a Vampire, I remember as a teenager being really into it. But when I first started getting into films, when I was probably about 12 or 13, I just used to stick a video in and just tape whatever was on telly. You used to get the little codes to set the timer. And I remember, probably accidentally and foolishly for a 13-year-old, I ended up with loads of like Cronenberg films and stuff on these videos. So quite soon realised I, love a bit of body horror. I do love slasher films. I think kind of serialised slashers I will always come back to because they're just really fun. Like, there's just a funness about them. But I love a good haunted house story. I think haunted houses and body horror are probably what feed most into my writing at the moment. So I'm quite into exploring the body as a haunted house, kind of filmed with haunted memories and traumas. I wrote a story about a haunted house that kind of eats anyone who's a threat to the people inside. And so kind of ideas of what a house can contain in terms of the memories within it and the experiences within it. And body horror, I think, again, coming back to kind of the addiction thing, there's so much there that can be drawn out in terms of not feeling in control of your body, or sometimes feeling too in control of your body. So there's a lot in those genres for me.
Body horror is one that makes me uncomfortable, but I force myself to watch. Something about unnecessary surgery and things like that really get under my skin, Pun
Literally. I'm fine with over-the-top violence. I'm not good with things like Hostel or the more torture porny kind of gratuitous, graphic, kind of realistic violence. I don't find that enjoyable at all. We'll happily watch someone turn themselves inside out or head spin or whatever else, but that's where I make a decision before going in. That's not the kind of horror film for me, and that's fine.
Yeah. We're on the same page there. We're not really drawn to that. I mean, if it's over the top, great. Evil Dead all day long, But the Hostel, and I've watched them, it's just not they're just not for me. That's not like my go-to kind of
I
stuff.
find them quite hard work. Like, I find it emotionally and kind of psychologically just like a chore to get through them. And I think, you know, and as well, I know in horror there's a lot of use of kind of violence against women. You know,
Right.
I kind of find a lot of it to be unjustified. So it's those kind of things that'll make me go, nah, that's not creative enough or interesting enough for me to watch it. Although I did you see In a Violent Nature recently?
I watched it actually. I'm torn on it, you know.
I didn't love it, but there was a really good inventive death in it that I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah. Otherwise, like, sort of the pacing, and I'm like, okay, you know.
Did you not? I kind of found when the camera was following the guy around the woods, so it was a bit like if you're playing, I don't know, Zelda or World of Warcraft, and there's just the there's someone walking around the woods. So I was like, this is quite relaxing, I guess. I don't know what's happening, but sure.
I did just 2 nights ago finally watch Terrifier 3 again while Kendall slept, and just to see what, you know, the hype is all about.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my niece watched it. I mean, I think she watched it like however she gets her movies. Let's put it that way. She doesn't go to the theater to see them.
Yeah.
She sees new movies, and she was, you know, describing, and she's like, but she can't handle like loud noises and any kind of creepy like jumping out stuff. So she could watch Terrifier 3, and then we just went to Madame Tussauds Wax Museum, and they had a little horror area. She couldn't even go in.
Oh, that's interesting.
Wow. So I watched Terrifier 3, and I was like, okay, yeah.
I'm starting to see a pattern with Kendall missing.
A lot of. If we don't start it at this time of the day, I'm going to be asleep.
It's a good thing that I'm open to rewatching stuff, because that seems, yeah,
that's part of the course.
But I mean, I will say, like, a good demonic possession or haunting will keep Kendall awake.
For sure. I love it.
What is it about those in particular?
Well, you know, I don't want to alienate listeners, but I just don't like it. Talk about being far-fetched. For me, that's equally far-fetched to thinking about a slasher film. You know, so because I'm not a quote believer in all of that stuff. I just love it. And it's never going to give me nightmares. Whereas I cannot watch a home invasion. You know what I mean? Like, that's just, I hate that stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, we've talked about it before, but like my family experienced not home invasion while we were home, but, you know, burglarized, they killed my dog, you know, really horrible things that as a 7-year-old, I never let go of.
I think that's kind of where I think I agree. If it stops being an escape, that's when I kind of find the horror difficult. You've just one of home invasions, absolutely, and I think anything to do with false accusations, I find it more terrifying than most things.
Right.
I avoid all of those, but I'll watch almost anything.
Yeah.
Well, something jumped into my head. I was thinking about like demonic possession / meets haunted house, and a movie does come to mind. It's called Terrified. I think it's from like 5 or 6 years ago. It's a Spanish language film. I'm not sure if you've seen it, Alex, but I highly recommend it. I know it's on Netflix here in the States. So yeah, not Terrifier, or Terrified.
That sounds great. I will check. Thank you.
The opening scene, wow. It's very inventive. Like, there's several inventive things that I've never seen in a horror movie before.
Ooh, excellent. I've just written it down. I will make
I wonder now how many times I slept through that one.
I mean, I've watched it at least 3 times. And I know Kendall's made it at least through the first scene that I'm talking about. And I won't spoil anything here, but it's like, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about.
Right.
I think it's in the first 5 minutes.
Oh, wow.
Oh, we just talk about horror movies all the time.
Yeah.
So, now, what is the horror community like in Manchester?
Oh, it's great. We have so there's a convention each year called For the Love of Horror. I didn't go last year. I was actually in New England last year when it was on. Did a little Stephen King pilgrimage around Maine. It was lovely. We have the convention called For the Love of Horror, and we have a film festival called Grimfest. And there's a festival, Women in Horror, like a small film festival. We've got some really good kind of indie cinema spaces and film screenings. Gasp Horror, some really good indie screening spaces in Manchester. But what I find is just I can go to stuff on my own. It's fine. Like, everyone is so welcoming. And actually, I started my PhD in January. So I did my first conference in May, which was at Northumbria University, and it was a horror studies now. I was so nervous because it was my first one. I was like, oh, it's an academic thing. And I got there and everyone just had the coolest T-shirts on, covered in tattoos. Everyone was super nerdy and I just had the best time. I was like, this is lovely. But it's because it's that kind of it's horror studies and everyone's big horror fans. And I think there's just a real kind of openness and enthusiasm generally. Obviously, there's always pockets in any fandom where it's not the case, but I've always found horror events and horror communities to be super welcoming. And I know it's been touched on a lot on the podcast as well, just kind of surprising people can find that initially when you're like, this is actually really nice.
It's kind of unbelievable how accepting people are there, and then you just see like literally all walks of life, And I've seen some images and footage For the Love of Horror, and I get the same vibes from that as I do the horror cons here in New England and California. It's just, it just crosses the ocean.
Yeah, it's lovely.
When you go to a horror event or a horror convention, what are you drawn to? The guests, the booths, the merch?
I'll always end up buying. I always go and say I'm not going to spend too much, but I will. I try, and if there's any horror writers there, I'll always try and buy kind of an anthology or something from a writer that I don't know about. I love going to kind of the market stalls, but it's always the guests. I just think kind of going, getting a seat and listening to the panels, listening to the guests, because even if it's someone that I've not particularly heard of, just hearing about the films being made or hearing about people's experiences of horror or whatever it is that they're sharing, I just love that. So I'd happily just kind of get a seat and listen to that all day. I haven't tended to do any of that. They did a Lost Boys photo op with them all the other year, and I missed that, which I was gutted about. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'm really hoping that next year that they have David Dasmalchian. I've bought my ticket. I was like, maybe they'll get him and I can meet him, because his comic book, Count Crowley, looks at addiction and sobriety and monsters and things. And he's been very open talking about his own recovery. And I love that. And he's in some awesome films as well. So I was like, that would be cool if he's like my dream guest for next year.
I do definitely get excited about the guest. Kendall doesn't quite get that. Although if there were a quarry convention, he would be losing his mind for. But you mentioned the Lost Boys photo op. I was thinking about when you mentioned The Craft earlier. It might be my favorite photo op. So they had a reunion of all four of the actors, and I think it was the first time they've ever been like to a convention together. And so what I did was I just lied on the ground. I said, "I put your feet on me." He's been like their boot. And Firuza Balk's got her boot on my head. It's just like,
that's amazing.
And she seems a bit like, why am I doing this? Right. It's great.
Rachel True was definitely all into it. So it's just,
Oh, I'd love to see that. That's amazing.
I will share it with you. Absolutely.
It's on the walls.
We have a collage of photos with wood backing. And we did the whole measuring and everything. So there's like 16 or 20 of them. It's just a hodgepodge of family and friends and horror.
Excellent.
So, one, we really appreciate you listening to the podcast, but I guess our final question is probably not going to be too much of a surprise for you. Alex, who is your favorite final person in a horror movie?
I was thinking of this because I wanted... Who should I pick? But actually, I have to go with Sidney Prescott. I have to, because like I said, when I was 13 when the first Scream film came out, and she was just the coolest, kind of punching Gale, dealing with nonsense boyfriends, murderous nonsense boyfriend,
Yes.
But I just thought it was such a smart film, and she's just such a cool character. And so I did a zine over summer called Making Friends with My Monsters, which was all about kind of horror and mental health. And half of it was talking about The Shining and addiction, and then the other half was this kind of final girl idea, and I used Sydney as the kind of poster girl for that stuff. Yeah. Just surviving.
I'm glad she's finally risen to the top and made the list, because I know she's been like runner-up for several people who had to go with either Nancy from A Nightmare on Elm Street or, of course, Laurie Strode. So, all right, Sydney, you're in there now.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Alex, you're just lovely. Please stay in touch. We would love to have you back on. And we're going to check out your novel and enjoy it.
Thank you. It's been lovely speaking to you both.
Yeah, thanks.
Alex, this conversation has been incredible. The way that you've used horror and storytelling as a tool for healing, reflection, and growth is exactly why we do this show. Whether it's finding safety in a scary story, rewriting our own trauma through fiction, or just embracing the weird, dark, wonderful corners of our minds, horror has this beautiful way of helping us face what haunts us without letting it consume us. We've talked a lot about monsters today, but as you've shown us, sometimes the most powerful thing horror does is remind us we're not alone in the darkness. And that's real magic. Thank you so much for sharing your story, your work, and your love of horror with us, Alex. And to our listeners, whether you're slashing through writer's block, slaying your own demons, or just finding comfort in a good, scary movie, remember, horror does heal. And if someone asks, is horror good for mental wellness? You tell them, of course it is. The Horror Heals podcast is produced and presented by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage, LLC.